Good morning, everyone. My name is Tara Jones. I am the Director of Dynamic Sales at ImageTag, and I want to thank you for joining today's webinar, and also Davis for providing the opportunity to present this content. Before we get started, we did upload a questionnaire or handout. If you look at the toolbar at the top of your screen, you should see a small icon that's white with looks like several documents, and there's a handout that you can download and use to follow along if you'd like to actually apply your current internal processes to the information that I'm going to present. So I'll give you just a minute to do that. So today we're going to talk about, specifically in the area of AP, really how to begin to think through your workflow design, your document routing and approval process, and how that process can be re-engineered to gain greater operational efficiency. So the first place I'd like to start is really telling you a little bit about who we are at ImageTag and the basis for the insight that we have in the area of not only document content management, transactional content management, but also document routing and approval. Essentially, ImageTag has a long history and a lot of experience in the document imaging market space. We were formed in 1999 as a standalone solution, and in 2005 brought generation 1 of what we call transactional content management to the marketplace. Really, the idea there is bringing transactions that are driven out of your ERP system together with the information or the paper that drives those transactions. We're privately held and profitable, and in fact, our 3 most recent quarters have been record-breaking for us. We invest heavily in R&D and hold 6 U.S. patents for our innovative technology. The market is responding really well, not only to our solution, but also to our methodology, which I'll review with you today. We are based solely on the Microsoft stack, and as a result are very nimble and agile in the development of our new product enhancements. So when we talk about being the undisputed leader in ERP, we are the only document content management company that's fully embedded into the dynamic space specifically and only. So when we talk about our R&D dollars and our approach to the market, all of our investment goes to solving the needs of our Dynamics users, whether that be Microsoft Dynamics GP or AX. We received several awards and hold 6 U.S. patents. We're a very customer-driven organization, and that really is the result of assessing the needs of our customers. And as a result of that, we have over 300,000 users worldwide. Our renewal rate continues to increase. We actually increased 3 basis points this previous year, and that's really the result of understanding in a broader way what the requirements and needs of our customers are. And we process over 1 billion documents annually through the QuickTag solution. So we're pleased to share our insight with IBIS's most valued customers in today's webinar. So I don't want to spend a lot more time here, and let's go ahead and I'll share what our agenda for today's call will be. So first, when approaching the process of defining and illustrating your document flow, you first want to define your goals and objectives. From there, then you begin the process of illustrating or capturing that document flow. It starts first with the document entry points, where that information is arriving into the organization, what routing and approval rules are currently in place, how you want that information retrieved and viewed, not only by the departments, but also by the broader enterprise, and then what data requirements does the enterprise have, again, both departmentally as well as from the enterprise. After you've illustrated or documented the workflow, it's always important to take that information and evaluate the ROI. Now, one thing about ROI is that you'll find that as you're going through this process, the ROI becomes quite visible very early on through the information that you begin to collect that perhaps has never been documented. A lot of times we find as we're going through the assessment with our prospective customers that the information has never been documented, so you've got manual processes that have never been laid to paper. And so it's very interesting when you begin to lay that out and see where the operational efficiencies can really take place. So we first begin with the goals and objectives. So we often see four primary goals. These are fairly high-level goals that organizations come to us with. So the first would be the necessity to reduce the cost tied to paper. Now it's interesting as you look at this, it's not just simply the piece of paper itself, the 2 or 3 cent cost of that piece of paper, but it's also the copying, the printing, the distributing, whether that be courier or FedEx, and the storage of that information. So it's interesting that that very piece of paper that's creating the transaction record in your ERP is costing a lot more money than you probably anticipate, and in many cases that cost has never been documented. So when that comes to light, typically it comes to light with the introduction or the realization of costs such as couriers or FedEx. Then the process often begins to explore ways to automate. In addition, another goal is the necessity to increase efficiency and productivity. We often see, and I would ask you the same, is there a duplication of effort within your process flow? Do you have multiple people doing the same thing, whether that's capturing information, coding invoices, touching paper multiple times because of reviews that need to go on? We often see burdens placed on management. So higher level individuals in the organization are often not only touching paper, but are often coding that and being a greater part of that process than really necessary, where technology can begin to take over. So as you go through the process of documentation, look for different areas of duplication that may be taking place, as well as different levels within your organization, such as departmental managers, your controllers, your assistant controllers, that are more involved in the approval process than need to be, simply because it's manual. You're not leveraging technology the way that technology has been designed to be used in workflow assessment. Third is improved access to information. So often a goal is to allow the organization to what we call self-serve. A lot of the burden today relies on the accounts payable department to provide the information both at a departmental level as well as at an enterprise or an executive level. So one of the questions is, do you want the organization to consume that information that accounting is driving into the ERP? If security is built around it, you may be able to achieve that if your culture permits. And then finally, another goal that we see is the simplification of audit and compliance. Sometimes organizations come to us simply because they've lost the information and can't produce it for their auditors due to a natural disaster, a move, multiple things that can happen where they simply cannot get to that information, or getting to that information is extremely time-consuming. If we drill a little deeper, or perhaps a little broader, here's some other areas that you may want to consider as it relates to objectives. The ability to compress your invoice receipt to pay cycle. So we sometimes see weeks or even months for an invoice to go through a manual process. So you can actually compress that into days. In addition, in the areas of reducing errors and accelerating discrepancy resolution, and in minimizing fraud and duplicate invoices, manual processes don't allow you to use the ERP checks and balances that exist because you're doing manual processes. So if that's something that you see as happening in the organization, that can also become a high-level objective. In addition, you have access to being able to tap into early payment discounts, strengthening vendor relationships, improving cash flow, and enhancing visibility and control. So if you look at the two final ones, manual processes don't allow visibility into the total amount outstanding that those invoices represent. So once you have visibility, then you can manage that, and then you can see where invoices are along the approval continuum. So again, it's all about shifting control once you're able to modify those. As the organization, just identifying what your primary and secondary objectives are is important as you go through the process of illustrating your workflow. So now we're going to jump right into workflow basics. So if you downloaded that document, this might be a good time as I go through each of these steps fairly quickly. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. So you begin to think about your own processes, and you can actually begin to start documenting these 4 primary steps of workflow. So the first one is document entry. So when we look at document entry, and if you'll notice, although we're talking a lot about AP, when you think about workflow and routing, you don't have to confine yourself just to AP. Typically when an invoice comes in, it's touching multiple departments. So while you can take a phased approach, which we always recommend, I never suggest that as an organization you move from a manual process to a fully automated process, essentially trying to boil the ocean. But you can take a very methodical approach, starting with AP, but what you'll see is that those documents are already touching multiple departments. So as you move through the AP process, first of how documents are arriving into the organization. So for example, are they arriving via email? Are they arriving via fax still? Or are they arriving via postal mail or FedEx? And what percentage of your documents, say your invoices, are arriving into each of these 3 areas? That will also determine your approach to automation in any given area. So you identify where and how the documents are arriving into the organization, and essentially you often don't have control over changing this. While we'd like all documents or all invoices to arrive a certain way in a certain format, in many cases that's just simply not feasible because we have hundreds, if not thousands, of vendors all sending us invoices in different formats with information located different places on those invoices, so automating that is often difficult. So once those documents arrive, then we look at ways to be able to automate that. So one of the recommendations that you can look into, if you have a high percentage of your invoices arriving via email or fax, is to actually look at having them arrive into an email or fax server address. And by doing that, you can actually automate the trigger of that document routing. So you can actually trigger the approval process, which we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later, so that now you're not printing out emails to distribute, or you're not spending money on paper as those faxes come in, or even having to copy multiple times to distribute that information. The second piece of document entry is looking at where those documents are arriving. So essentially, you have 2 different things going on. So I would ask you, in your organization, are you centralized or decentralized? So in this particular scenario, this customer scenario, they came to us, and their headquarter location was over here in Nova Scotia. But they have 16 locations spread out across the country where those documents are arriving. So the document arrives at one of those distributed locations well outside of central accounting, and those documents were actually being couriered or FedExed to Nova Scotia. So on a daily basis, they were gathering, packaging, and shipping via overnight courier to the head office. So even though some companies begin to scan and email the documents to avoid those overnight costs, those documents are still printed, manually sorted, and distributed once they arrive at headquarters for approval and then filing. So when you look at your own organization, are you a centralized accounting function? Do you have locations, whether they're in distributed locations such as different states or even different countries, or in locations across the city? And how is that impacting the approval of those documents for payment? So in looking at your document entry questions to be asking, there's really 4 questions. So the 4 questions are: how do documents arrive? Where do documents arrive? Where are the scanning devices located? So can you get the information that's arriving in the disparate location to headquarters via a device that's located there? And are computers available at the point of receipt? So those are the 4 questions that you want to ask as they surround the document entry. So what we're doing in this step is assessing the front-end capture capability. Can you capture those documents up front in the beginning part of the process? So companies in an Aberdeen study who implemented front-end document capture, meaning creating a scanned digital copy of a physical invoice to be used in the approval process, reported invoice processing times 34% faster than those in companies who processed invoices manually. So in the previous example, where the documents were arriving at the distributed location, packaged and shipped to headquarters, that's often known as back-end capture. So if that's what you're doing today, that back-end capture process is more than likely costing you efficiency because you don't have the visibility to be able to speed up that process and get those invoices paid to be able to accomplish your objectives. So to document that, essentially we look at where the invoices arrive. This is just a simple workflow diagram via either email, postal mail, or in some cases, if you've got facility locations, if you're in the healthcare industry, if you're in food and beverage, if you're in distributed care, where the invoices are dropped off at the facility, you've got that aspect as well. So the next step after document entry review is to look at and to consider the routing and approval that's currently going on. So within each organization, you've got a set of rules that when you look at an invoice are driving that invoice through an approval process. So workflow or document routing and approval is nothing more than an event-driven service that takes action when conditions are met. So if we break that down within your organization, there's a trigger that starts the workflow, that starts the approval process. Often, that's when an invoice is received. So that's where we look at how is that invoice received. Is it received via email, via fax, via postal mail, and where is it received? Then there's going to be a rule. You have rules in place, whether you know it or not, that where there's a condition that must be met before work can be done on that invoice. So an example might be is that invoice belongs to a certain department, such as marketing or IT or facilities management. Or a rule might be that invoice amount is greater than a certain amount. Or you could have even more complex rules that say not only does the invoice arrive to marketing, but it's over $1,000, and that's going to drive specific actions. So it can get somewhat complicated. You'd be surprised if you really documented it that it might be more complicated than you thought. Is that if you've got an invoice that's arriving to a specific department and is over or under a specific threshold, the action may be to drive that invoice to 2 different people based on either department or based on amount. So it's important to document your processes in terms of the business rules driving them. So throughout the process, we're going to ask which of these components and define them. What's the trigger? What's the rule? And then what's the action that needs to take place? And all we're doing is putting those to paper. So now we've talked a lot about accounts payable, but what are some other document types that you can begin to automate? And this will come to light in a couple of future examples. So in AP, you've got invoices. You also have purchase requisitions. So when you're looking at the percentage of invoices that are created in Dynamics versus the invoices that are attached to a purchase order, that can also determine where you want to start. So there are solutions that can actually automate the purchase requisition process if you find that a large percentages of your invoices are tied to a requisition or tied to a purchase order. If you've got informal processes in place around purchase requisition, but you have a lot of them that you're processing on an informal basis, I would encourage you to work with your IBIS team to explore options to be able to automate that process as well. So first identify the percentage of invoices versus purchase recs. In the area of accounts receivable, you can also automate the flow of information that's coming back, such as proof of delivery. There's also a plethora of document types that you can automate in the area of HR. Whether you're a Dynamics user or not, this will all come together exactly as we've laid it out, looking at rules, triggers, and actions. So a couple of examples of routing levels. So there's a notion of a document flow. When a document arrives, where does that document go? So if we go back to our original design, where is it arriving and how is it arriving? Then you look at who does it initially go to. Often we see it arriving in AP first. From AP, it often goes to an approver based on a rule. The approver either approves or rejects it, and then it goes back to AP for entry into Dynamics. So that's a very simple, single level of approval. We also can get more complex if you've got documents that actually go through a second tier approval. So the document still arrives, it often still goes to AP, you still have your approval, your first approver, but then you have that other rule. Perhaps it's an amount threshold. Perhaps it's a GL account threshold. Is this a fixed asset or a non-fixed asset invoice? That perhaps drives it to a controller or to a CFO. They either approve or reject it, and then it lands into AP for entry. So these two very simple processes can be applied to any document type that I shared with you in the approval process. Obviously, the attributes are going to change because you're not going to have an amount on a HR document or on a contract document. But as you go through this, you're identifying what those rules and triggers are so that you can begin to lay that out. So here's an example of automating a routing process. So as we discussed, the documents are received, in this case, at a facility. There's 16 facilities across the U.S. The documents are scanned, addressing front-end capture. They're driven, the rule, by the department. And as you can see over here on the right-hand side, that process is applied to multiple document types across 6 different departments. So this is how you can begin to pull in other departments into your process, because a simple invoice can touch any of these departments. When we talk about the way this information is consumed now is going to be different as we look at this in a little bit more detail. So that's routing. Now let's talk a little bit about approvals. So when we look at approvals, one of the challenges is often our managers are out of pocket or they're at distributed locations. So one of the questions to ask is, one, if they're BlackBerry users or if they're smartphone device users, would they be open or could they approve invoices via their device versus logging onto a computer as they're on the road or they're busy in the factory or in the facility or moving across the country? So can approvals be automated? Can they be automated via email? Can they be automated via access to a browser, for example, so that all the invoices can be captured there? So now you begin to look into the ability to provide those invoices in an easily consumable way to your approver teams. So here's a list of questions that you want to work through when identifying and capturing your routing and approval requirements. So what are the triggers for each document? What are the document approval rules? What attributes are being used? Is it GL? Is it invoice type? Is it amount? Is it as simple as an individual that always approves certain invoices? What data elements are required to determine if that rule is met? How many levels of approval are required? What are the rules? Do they vary by department? So you can use the same concept across all departments using the same methodology. What are the actions that happen when the rule conditions are met? What happens if a document is not approved? So how do you handle rejections? Does it have to go all the way back to AP? Do rejections have to be handled by a certain individual? You also want to begin to identify who your approvers are across the organization. Who's touching or viewing that document in the departments? What levels? What kind of checks and balances are going on? Once they approve that document, then we'll talk about, do they need to consume it again? Will they ever need to go back and reference that information, or is it really just simply them agreeing to pay that invoice? And then what type of access do approvers have? Do they have a Dynamics license? Are they spending a lot of time in the ERP? Do they not have a license, but they have easy access to an internet browser? And then what about email? So which method of approval do they prefer? So again, the trigger is the event that starts the workflow, the rule is the condition that must be met before the work can be done, and the action is the work that must be done on that invoice, approve or reject. So the third aspect of designing your workflow is looking at who needs to retrieve and view that information. How does that information need to be consumed? So the questions to ask around this area, we touched on them in the previous slide, is who needs to view the document? Is it only the approver? Do they only need to approve it one time, or will they need to consume the information later? How do they find it? How does your organization access that information? You can think of it as, how is it filed today? Is it filed by vendor? Is it filed by document invoice number? Is it filed by batch, a batch run, or a check run? So the same way that your filing cabinets are organized today is very similar to how you can begin to automate the retrieval of that information using technology. In addition, what security is required? So those in AP are going to see different information than those in HR. Those in a department may need to consume information differently than your executive. So what security is required? Who do you want to see what? And then where do they view it? Do you prefer they view it in SharePoint, for example, via a browser, or via your ERP? So where is your preferred method of viewing this information once it's been captured? So to exemplify this should look familiar. We're picking up at the tail end of the process. So this talks a little bit about different levels of retrieval. So when you look at documents, invoices coming in through AP, they're being viewed or consumed through GP in this scenario. The same would apply if you're an AX user. The same may hold true for AR in the area of AR. But if we jump down to HR departments, such as HR or payroll, whereas an AP invoice may need to go through an approval process, an HR document or a payroll document doesn't need or doesn't have the same sort of actions. So you identify where the AP invoice is going to end up for viewing, such as in GP, versus an HR document ending up perhaps in a browser. And if it ends up in a browser or in a central repository, do you want to provide those other than your department executives the ability to see that information? So would you actually like your employees now to be able to see the information that's been captured by the department teams? So we can also extend this outside of AP. This is an example of access to HR information by employee ID. So if you think of your HR department, whether or not you're using Dynamics, the Dynamics HR module or not, you can begin to consider if you want HR information, for example, to be consumed by the individuals who information is being added. So in this scenario, you have three different options. You have the ability to see the information again via Dynamics. You have the ability to see the information via a central repository or through a simple internet browser. And you also have the ability to extend it, capturing it in Dynamics, but then having it flow through and capitalizing or leveraging SharePoint if you've deployed SharePoint through the organization. So again, your whole thought process around retrieval is really what's the best way, what's the most effective way for your organization to be able to consume or retrieve or view that information. So that's all part of the design that goes into place when you consider your workflow. The thing that I warn you about is when you're going through the process, don't try to overlay your manual processes with technology. We often see that where you look at the processes today and the questions that you ask are, can technology do what we're doing today? Versus, here's what we're doing today. What can technology do to create and drive greater productivity and efficiency? And then how much change and what's the pace of change that can take place within an organization to create a quick adoption of technology because you're moving from a manual process to an automated process. So the fourth and final part of workflow design is looking at your data requirements. So when we talk about data requirements, this also bleeds over a little bit into reporting as well. Because imagine all of that information that's captured up front when we talked about front-end capture versus back-end. So now it's become completely visible. So during this stage, what we're doing is we're identifying what information do we want to capture up front that we have available on the back end. So here's 4 different questions that you want to go through. Some of them are tied directly to the ERP, some of them may not be. So first of all, does the document result in an ERP transaction? In the case of a PO requisition or an invoice, that document you would want to result in an ERP transaction, and you would want that image to be attached to that transaction. However, in the case of another document type, perhaps that's one of your HR documents, an employee review or a W-9 or any of the other information, if you don't have the HRP module, that document may not be used to create the transaction on the back end, but you want easy access to it. So which documents result in a transaction in Dynamics and which are simply just captured? What are the minimum requirements? So for those of you out there that are GP users, we know that vendor ID, document number, date, and amount are all required for Dynamics to create a transaction. Are there other requirements or other attributes when your teams look at an invoice that drive the rules or the determination of who's going to approve those documents? So you've got your minimum requirements, and you also have your internal requirements of what other attributes do you use to determine how that document flows to the organization. The third question you want to ask is, at what point are you able to collect the data? So when we go back to the goals and objectives we talked about earlier, are the right people capturing the information? Are the right people at the right level interacting with those documents? If a manager is manually coding or adding vendor IDs or doc numbers or dates, via a ink stamp on an invoice, is that what they should be doing? Or can that be automated, and can that data collection be shifted to a lower paid or a lower level individual to capture it and to trigger the workflow? So those are some questions that you want to ask. One of an example that had come up in one of our customer accounts is that we talked a little bit about front-end capture. When those documents arrive into the mailroom, ideally, you'd want to capture them in the mailroom if possible. The reason is because that invoice or that document becomes immediately visible to the enterprise, to whoever has access to it. However, with that being said, if you've got someone that's been in the mailroom for the entire course of the tenure of your organization, or you don't have, or it's not feasible to have a scanning device in your mailroom, you may not be able to impact the ability to capture the information that early in your process. So you really want to look at where and what makes sense for your organization, and then make sure that the technology is flexible enough to be able to meet you where you are today, but then still grow with you as you identify areas where you want to be more, or you can be more efficient and productive. The other part of the data review process is, are there any other systems or integrations that you want as part of this, that are part of this routing and approval process? So you look at what you have in place today, how those individuals are consuming that information, the impact of those modules or those systems on your workflow, and if that needs to be taken into consideration during your design phase. So now I'm going to go through two examples of both a centralized and a decentralized workflow, kind of bringing it all together for you. So this is actually a real-life workflow that's been documented. You guys, I'm sure, could maybe even do it at a little bit more sophisticated level, but this will give you an idea of how those four basics kind of come together. So up here at the top is where you have all your documents arriving. So in this case, this is a centralized workflow. All of the documents are arriving at a central location, but they're flowing through different departments within that organization. So if we look at those documents arriving in a mailroom, the first question to ask is, can documents be captured in the mailroom? rather than moving to this first and second step where they're sorted and then they're routed, in this case, to 16 different departments. So you want to identify where they're arriving, and in this case, the rule is based on department. If it's Department 1, it goes to the designated approver. If it's Department 2, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have your action, both based on department and here based on invoice amount. So this could be considered a multi-level approver. So this is how we get started in going through each of the 4 steps of your approval process. And within each of these steps, I would encourage you to go into greater detail in capturing who are those 16 departments, who are those designated approvers, and can you make changes as each of these steps? Or even asking, why do we do it this way? If the controller is controlling both the batch upon entry and the batch before posting, does that make sense? Is that required today because it's manual and you've got certain individuals going through that process, or is there another cultural reason? Can that be changed? Can that be modified if you begin to trust that the rules and the triggers that are in place eliminate the error that can take place because they're rules driven? So as you're going through this, then what we're looking for is duplication of effort. You know, is the department point of contact, AP, and the receptionist all contributing to information of the same document? Are they touching it multiple times? Is manual coding taking place? When manual coding is taking place and you're not utilizing your dynamic system, that opens up the possibility of error. Can you eliminate that? In addition, do you have individuals that are doing job responsibilities that could be eliminated? For example, are you scanning documents multiple times? Are you copying them? Is it requiring extra resources? So in this scenario, you've got a completely disconnected document management system that lays outside of the Dynamics ERP. So are you storing the documents on the back end, but are those documents disconnected from your ERP? So that as you go into the individual transactions within your ERP, you don't have access or visibility into the actual invoice that drove that transaction. So you're operating in a disconnected way. Do you have a sneaker net routing process going on which creates delays in payment? Are individuals actually walking those invoices from desk to desk? Are they making copies of those invoices and using those copies as a means to follow up with your department point of contacts? Are your department point of contacts or managers spending too much time on invoices, reviewing, coding that could be spent on strategic tasks? So these are all questions that when you document this, don't document for the sake of document, but begin to apply some strategic thinking about why do we do it this way, and is there a possibility to change it? The other example, because you often operate either centrally or decentralized. So in our earlier example, it was a decentralized. Headquarters was in Nova Scotia. We had sites across the U.S., 16. In this scenario, there's 5 sites. So headquarters is in Jacksonville, but we have 5 sites across the U.S., and within those 5 sites, you've got documents arriving in multiple methods. You've got a site administrator. You have approvers that at times code, at times don't. So I would ask myself, can that change, or does that have to stay the same? Is there a second level of approver? And then how do those batches then flow once they're entered back to the headquarter and back to post and check print? So this is another example. Now again, I would go into a little bit more detail because what you might find within each of your 5 sites is a different process. If your processes haven't been documented, each site may not be doing or following the same process. There may be loose compliance that's going on within each of those sites, so you don't have consistency. With technology, technology brings in a level of consistency through all sites, yet provides the flexibility so that it can be changed as your organization grows and as you identify, which you inevitably will, areas of greater operational efficiency. Now, throughout this process, you are capturing a lot of the information that's going to help you evaluate the ROI on moving from a manual to an automated workflow process. So there's 2 different areas that you want to consider as you're looking at ROI. The first area is consider paper's impact on AP. You know, most of the time it's not whether you have a paper problem, it's how much is that paper problem truly costing you. In some cases, it may not be costing you anything. In other cases, it may be costing you more than you realize. That's why we encourage that even if you don't move forward on a workflow project, that you at least take the time, if you haven't already done so, to document it. So an average organization, and I've seen just about all of these in play with different customers that I've personally been able to interact with, makes 19 copies of each document. I've seen organizations come to us because they were making copies on multiple colored papers, and their biggest problem was they were running out of different colors to make copies of their invoices that they were using to file to visually be able to identify different batches and check runs. An average organization also spends $20 in labor to file each document, $120 in labor searching for each misfiled document. That could happen during, times like audit and compliance where that information is mandatory. Organizations often lose documents and then spend, several hours recreating each document that's been lost. And there may be additional costs here that we haven't considered, but I would just encourage you to consider, is paper in and of itself costing you money that you could actually eliminate? And the next, which you will have done through the design phase, is gather the metrics. So there's really 3 areas where you can look into and you should look into. So the first is volume. Both from an enterprise level, how many documents are flowing through your organization per year across all departments? So that's taking a very broad and very strategic approach. When we talk about documents, that's a document packet. How many average pages are there per document? So how many documents per year are flowing through the organization? And then you look at volumes within departments. So we're looking at AP. How many total invoices per year? What's your monthly volume within AP? What about AR? What about AP, legal, contract? What are the volume of information that's flowing? So any department in your organization that has a filing cabinet or more than one filing cabinet or is storing documents off-site is a candidate to automate document flow. And a document flow doesn't necessarily have to mean approvals. In the previous example, AP invoices go through an approval process most of the time. Sometimes they don't. They're used to create the transaction. You have HR documents, contracts, vendor contracts that don't go through an approval process, but they are still part of workflow design. They're still part of a flow that's going on within the organization. During this step 2, I would also look at, are you using purchase orders in addition to invoice, or are you not? And what percentage? Is that percentage increasing? Is it informal? Is it formal? Do you want to formalize that process? What's the risk today of having an informal process? Then the second piece in the ROI development is then looking at each individual process, first starting with AP. So now you've got your broader number. Now you look at a specific document type, that would be invoice, and you look at what percentage of cost is tied to document handling. Now this often gets a little more difficult because most organizations consider document handling as part of the function or the role of your AP clerk or your AP team. But you also have the document cost of those that are handling that information outside of AP. You've got your managers, you've got your controllers, and your CFO. So each of those touch points of those that are handling a piece of paper for the purposes of approval are taking away valuable time or strategic time that those individuals could be spending to drive revenue and profitability through the organization. And then we look at the metrics around handling. So we go a little bit deeper. We look at, centralized versus decentralized. There's often more cost when you're operating in a decentralized environment. How many AP employees do you have? What's the monthly cost of that AP employee? How many approvers do you have? And what's the monthly cost of that approver? So as you move from AP employee to approver, it's going to cost you more if there's more handling or you're duplicating efforts of those individuals across the organization. So those are the three primary areas or metrics where you're going to gather the information to be able to create your ROI analysis. And again, a lot of that information is captured through that workflow design. So I would encourage you as you go through that, we talked about capturing the details, capture those details as you go through that design phase. So with that, I hope that I provided enough information to allow you to get started. If you have any additional questions, you'd like to do a one-on-one workflow design, or you'd like to see a tailored demonstration of what technology can do to move you from a manual to an automated process, then we'd ask you to call or email, info@ibis.com. They are a phenomenal team of consultants that understand workflow, that understand the integrated systems that are part of the AP process as well as part of other processes that even touches over into CRM, into project accounting, into other areas where you can gain greater efficiency. So they'd be happy to work with you, and I'd like to thank you for your time today. I hope it's been valuable, and please don't hesitate to call or email your IBIS representative if you have any questions. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time and wish you a really good day.